Hey gamers, a new major skip was found this week for Farewell, dropped as a surprise improvement to the task that netted a time save of 45 seconds and counting. The skip was found and tasked by Vamp and Cr33pyCat, and a link to the updated task is in the description if you're curious. The skip is entirely possible in real time as well, but it requires a pretty serious reroute of the movement in the level, so it'll probably be a week or two before world record runs with it start popping up. If you're not up to speed though, here's a brief summary of the trick. The starting cutscene in Farewell removes Madeline's gravity. This probably happens to prevent her from falling off to the right during the cutscene. If you jump the frame after interacting with the cutscene, Madeline flies to space and will continue to float until the cutscene is skipped. If you skipped a cutscene at a point that would place Madeline into the first real room of Farewell, you'll properly load into the room and skip the Madeline orb and other introduction cutscenes. This has been known for a while, but an extension of it was found. At the start of Farewell, you normally have 2 dashes, and a trigger in the middle of the first real screen of the level is what forces you to 1 dash. The trigger is normally unavoidable, since the cutscene places you directly inside of it. However, with this glitch you spawn into the screen outside of the trigger, and then, from there, you can move over the trigger, which avoids being forced to 1 dash and allows you to keep 2 dashes for most of the level. This persists until Stubbornness, the set block section, which has an unavoidable cutscene that sets you back to 1 dash for the rest of the level. That's the most basic summary of the trick without getting into the tutorial part, so if that's all you're interested in this video, that's all you really need to know. The time save for this is incredibly difficult to quantify, since we've essentially been given an entirely new level to optimize, but I would expect the time save to be well over 30 to 40 seconds for human players. Any answer I could give you on how much this trick saves would be outdated in a number of days, but this is the biggest speedrunning skip in Celeste in a very long time. As far as what to call the skip, there's been a lot of meme names thrown around lately, but keep in mind that giving it a nonsense name makes it impossible for people not in on the joke to get what you're talking about. For the rest of the video, I'm going to be calling it Dash Trigger Skip, and if you ask a question involving it using a similar name, someone will probably know what you're talking about. This is also how the category is split on speedrun.com, so this is probably the best way to go. With that introduction out of the way, let's get into the actual tutorial for the trick. As a disclaimer, this is as new tech gets. Some of the setups will likely be refined and maybe even eventually solved, in which case I'll either make a follow-up video or update the description if another tutorial comes around. I'm not promising anything on this front, but just note things in this video are for a very new trick and might become outdated. Next, note that this trick is pretty difficult. There's a lot of moving parts and it's probably the most difficult trick in the game to wrap your head around. Everything is pause bufferable if you desire and has solid cues, but any mistake you make on this trick is extremely punishing. If you're going for an IL, you can be pretty aggressive with resets, but keep in mind that if you plan on doing this in full game and you fail a part of it, you can lose up to 20 seconds. If you learn to skip, you also have to really commit to doing it, so I might recommend holding off on this if you're a newer player and just want to start easy. Lastly, this trick works on all versions of the game with a Farewell patch, but you'll be at a pretty large disadvantage without 1.4, which has pause buffering. Unfortunately, at the time of this video, the Xbox and PS4 ports still don't have the 1.4 patch, so you'll be unable to pause buffer the early part of this trick. It's still possible, but it's really inconsistent and dumb. You could do IL runs of it, but probably not full game runs. Alright, let's finally get into it. For practicing, I would recommend 2 mods, Speedrun Tool and Celeste TAS, which will both be linked in the description. Speedrun Tool is a near mandatory mod for learning how to execute the skip, to the point where if you don't have access to the tool, I would hold off on learning this. Save states make this so much easier to break the trick into pieces and solve everything individually. If you're on console and have a PC that can run the game but isn't powerful enough for recording, I would highly recommend using PC just for Speedrun Tool and then switch to your console for doing runs. Celeste TAS is less necessary, but provides a lot of useful tools for visualizing things in my opinion. In particular, it has a hitbox viewer, positional data, and centering the camera to Madeline. You won't need any knowledge of task creation, but the tools it provides can be pretty useful. Of course, the first part of this trick is triggering the anti-gravity during the cutscene. This gets solved with pause buffering, but it's not as easy as it seems. The simplified version of the inputs for this are talk and then 1 frame later release talk and jump. These inputs are incredibly difficult on buffered since it requires a 1 frame tap of talk. Thanks to pause buffering though, you can make this 100% consistent. First, you need to bind a talk plus pause bind. You should be able to do this to your pre-existing pause button with no issue, so no need to worry about running out of buttons on your controller. With this bind, you can actually pause buffer the 1 frame of talking by just rhythmically pressing the bind 4 times. Check the input display in the top right corner to see the timing for this. From here, unpause and buffer a jump shortly after, and Madeline should fly to space. You can do this without this bind if you really want to, but it's harder and likely to just end up slower from subtle input swap. For troubleshooting, you can confirm if the buffer worked by pressing it 3 times and seeing if skip cutscene appears on the menu. If it doesn't, you are too slow and can save this by just going for it again. If you're too fast, the third pause will fail. This is unlikely to happen unless you're just mashing though. The unpause and jump afterwards is the tricky part of this to get timing for. If you don't jump, you press jump too late. This is personally the most difficult part of this to get muscle memory for, but it's a 5-frame window and you just need to focus on pressing it early. If you fail this part and talk without jumping, you'll need to restart chapter though, and that's about a 5-second time loss for full game runs. For those not on the 1.4 patch or looking for an unpause buffered method of this trick, bind a talk button to one of your jump buttons. Binding this to your second jump button should cause no conflicts. Now, hyper into the cutscene trigger, and press the jump plus talk button to do a bunny hop, and hope for the best. You need to line this up so that the jump plus talk button is pressed to frame Madeline exits the cutscene trigger by moving, making this positional based and most often frame perfect. This saves about half a second to the buffered method though, which might be a worthwhile time save for sweaty ILs, especially since resets this early in the level are pretty fast. With no access to pause buffering, this is the best setup I could find, and unfortunately it's frame perfect at best. You can use this if you want to just grind the IL, but don't do this method in full game unless you have a death wish. Be on the lookout for a better unbuffered method, but I wouldn't hold your breath unfortunately. Now for the weird part of this trick. First of all, since I don't know where else to mention it, you do want to mash through some of the text in this cutscene. Advancing to the "This isn't fair" text box actually advances Madeline forward a few pixels, since she walks during the cutscene. If you can't wrap your head around how this works, the room layout is stacked like this. Madeline continues to float upwards out of the bounds of the room, and your goal is to skip the cutscene when you're within this window in this specific screen. Once you skip cutscene, this camera will snap to Madeline and load her into whichever room she is currently in. The window for the skip cutscene to simply spawn into the desired room with no other concerns for positioning is about 2 seconds. If you're too late on the skip cutscene, Madeline will be brought to the bottom of the cloud room since you try to enter a room that doesn't exist. If you're too early, you'll appear higher up in the cloud room. Unfortunately, either of these mistakes will lose you around 15 to 20 seconds since you need to restart chapter. How you time this depends on the setup you're doing for the next room and will be heavily dependent on comfort. The method I personally found was to wait on the first text box until the arrow appears in the bottom right corner, and then mash through the rest of the text boxes. Multiple confirm buttons are your friend here. Then, once the bird flies to the bottom of the screen, skip cutscene. If this setup is running a bit slow or fast for you, adjust accordingly. You can get pretty creative with your setups here. One setup found by Zkad was that setting a manual timer once Madeline goes off screen and then skipping cutscene after it reaches 15 seconds lines up pretty well. Depending on your setup though, you don't need to be that precise with this, and this is probably the easiest part of the trick overall. Now for the hard part of this trick. You need to make it over this trigger, and any mistake will instantly kill the run and lose 20 seconds. For learning this part of the trick, I would recommend having Celeste tasks and turning hitboxes on so that you can have a visualization of the trigger you want to avoid. This moon block moves in a cycle, and you want it to be as high as possible when you jump off. There's 4 main methods I've seen of doing this, and I'll go through them from easiest to hardest in my opinion, but I think they all also have advantages and disadvantages. I'll be including a doc which has more detailed info for all of these setups. This video is already quite long and pointing out every cue is difficult. Input display is also your friend here. I would also recommend splitting up the first and second part of these setups, since they all end in a fairly precise up dash to right dash. Practice these with a safe state from ideal positioning to get the timing down, since they require a bit of spacing on the inputs and aren't entirely intuitive. As well, this will just be kind of a surface level view of all of these setups, but they require a pretty firm grasp of the movement of the game and a lot of small details. Explaining everything on this would drag on the video far too long. If you need any additional help with these setups, I would suggest joining the Celeste Discord and asking the speedrun help channel, which will likely get you a pretty quick and detailed answer. I can also answer simple questions in the comments, but you'll probably get a faster and more detailed answer in that Discord server. First up is Gili setup. Up dash upright dash on entry to land as far left on the block as possible. Wait for the block to line up with a small square of debris in the background, and then space out 2 up dashes. Walk left, do a super, but release right afterwards. Then up dash and delay a horizontal dash. This setup is fairly straightforward, but it felt a little bit inconsistent for me. You can occasionally get moon boosts that you don't want to, and it can make things awkward, and it isn't so great with pause buffering. This is also the slowest setup overall, though it's only slightly slower than Prof setup without buffering inputs. That said though, a lot of people have had success with this. This method is also pretty useful to know as a backup to the other methods. Next is Prof setup. Neutral jump off the moon block until it's at the highest point of the cycle. Then, from a neutral, get a super without holding right that is boosted by the moon block. This is done by dashing horizontally at the top of the moon block so that you get corner corrected to the top while still pushing the block forward. The main advantage of this setup is that it's easy to pause buffer. From a neutral, you can forward dash and buffer to a specific frame, and then do a neutral super and the rest of the trick just works. Personally, I found the pause buffer to be unnecessary, but it's up to you. Details of which frame to advance to are in the document and the description. Overall, this is the most consistent setup for me, but it does have a few more chances at failure since it can be a bit stressful getting the moon boost after several seconds of neutrals. Overall, this is probably my personal favorite setup in terms of consistency and speed. Now for the setup I found while making this video. Up dash, upright dash onto the moon block similar to Gili's setup. Then, walk off the moon block, up dash into the bottom of it to push it upwards and get corner corrected past it. Then, wall bounce and super off the moon block. The setup is quite fast, but it's pretty hard. My main advice is just to practice. It's very feel-based, but is 100% consistent, and it saves about 2 seconds to the previous setups. That said though, the other ones are definitely easier to execute. I didn't look into it much, but this strat might also work well with pause buffering the super out of the wall bounce. Let me know if you find anything interesting with that. The final option is just to YOLO this. By skipping the cutscene at the correct time, you can do a super off the moon block and just make it. It's very straightforward, but the timing makes the skip cutscene very difficult, so you need a good cue for the cutscene skip or be willing to reset if you want to do this. That said, it saves about 5 seconds over Prof and Gili setups, and about 2 seconds over mine. These are the 4 main options I've seen. Unfortunately, they're all quite tricky, and again, this is the hardest part of the trick by far. If you're stumped on this, come back to it later and give it a few minutes a day. You can keep it on the back burner while you learn the rest of the level. With practice though, you can nail some of these setups very consistently, with my best being 7 times in a row with Prof setup just after an hour or so of practice. That should be all the details of this trick though. I would suggest breaking it down piece by piece and focusing on segments at a time until things click. Don't be discouraged, this trick tests a lot of things and is pretty comfortably the most difficult trick in the game that doesn't require anything frame perfect or pixel perfect. That said, keep in mind this is just a small piece of the puzzle. You need to go and find a route for the rest of the level that uses 2 dashes to save your time. If you notice anything inaccurate or worth updating in a video, feel free to comment here as well. Also make sure to check out the video description where I'll note any updates or corrections to the video. Again, if you have any questions, I would highly suggest joining the Celeste Discord and asking in the speedrunning help channel. Thanks for watching. This project ended up being larger than expected, but I wanted to be thorough. Hopefully it's useful to you.